Okay. So this sub-chapter is called Without Masks. The fundamental nature of a man is revealed specifically in the small details. Usually, wait a minute, did I do this yesterday? No, I didn't. Apologies. Okay. The fundamental nature is revealed in the small details. Idea in the most basic form is expressed in the Gemara Eruvin 65b. And it says, in these three things, the essence of a person is perceptible in his pocketbook, his cup, and his anger. A person who is intoxicated or angry loses his inhibitions. Uninhibited, one's hidden thoughts and feelings are revealed. Similarly, one's attitude towards trivial matters reveal his inner dimensions. The concept is articulated in the opening word of Parshat Akev. That's Devarim. Akev is used as, in this context, connotes as a consequence. As a consequence of hearkening to these ordinances, if you observe and perform them, Hashem your God will safeguard for you in the covenant and the kindness that he swore to your forefathers. The ensuing verses promise multiple blessings to a person who keeps Hashem's commandments. Rashi notes the double and tendre, never heard of that word before, of the word aked, which literally means heel. He explains that the verse refers to the easy mitzvahs that a person tramples with his heels. Accordingly, the blessings promised will come for observing and performing the mitzvahs that people readily trample with their heels. Sfas Emetz in Devarim elucidates this verse and explains the idiomatic use of the word aked, which indicates the lowest part of the body. There are mitzvahs that depend on one's head, heart, and other limbs. There are also mitzvahs related to his heel. These are the easy mitzvahs. The head is more important than the heel. Nonetheless, the heels provide the foundation upon which a person stands. Likewise, the easy mitzvahs have precedence since the whole foundation of Judaism rests on them.
What did that mean by the easy mitzvahs? Like things that are easy to do, like to fill in, or what?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe, yeah, I don't know what easy mitzvah. It doesn't say.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Damon.
Yeah.
Can I also say something now?
Sure.
Okay, this is it says, hello, Rabbi. Why do people conclude the emails with the Shana Tova greeting at this time of year before it's close to Rosh Hashanah? Okay, we begin to wish each other Kativa v'chatzima tova may be written and signed for the good, starting from Rosh Chodesh Elul. Some are accustomed to by doing this from the 15th Menachem Av. In a letter to a friend, one must begin or end with a blessing for the person to have a good year. One is to continue to do so until Rosh Hashanah. From Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, one writes Gama Chatima Tova, may you be sealed for the good. From after Yom Kippur, it is no longer accustomed to write the blessing, although some do so until Hoshana Rabbah. I wish you a KCT, Kativa v'chamtima tova. That's what he wrote.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Good. I didn't know that. So, what we were discussing yesterday, we went through the Mishnah, which was read very well. Gavin, thank you, much appreciated. And we are going to discuss the actual Gemara now. I thought it was prudent not to get into the Gemara yesterday. It just didn't make sense to, honestly. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just discuss with you what are we dealing with in terms of damage. And what I'd like to do is put my phone on airplane mode, right? All right. So the Gemara in the 87th daf discusses an injury case that will relate to our Mishnah. Okay. Rav Elazar inquired of Rav, in the case of one who wounds a minor, daughter of others, to whom is the injury payment made? In other words, what we basically want to know is, do we say that since the merciful one conferred the gains of the girl's stage of Narus to the father, the injury payments also belong to her father? What is the reason? Maybe what's the rationale? Because the assailant lessened her value because she's under her father's care. Or perhaps it's only the gains of the stage of Narus that the merciful one conferred to the father, such as her betrothal money, for if he wants to give her over in marriage to a man smitten with boils even, he can give her over to him. But regarding injury payments, since if he wants to wound her, he may not wound her, the merciful one did not confer to him the payments for injury. So what I want to do is unpack this Gemara and just go through each concept piece by piece. Okay. Now, as far as Rav Elazar is concerned in his question to Rav, let's just see what 3 stages a woman goes through in terms of independence, and that independence is related to her sexual maturity. Okay. So let's just call it physical development. It's probably a little bit cleaner. So the first stage you have is for a boy, you say the word a katan. For a girl, you say katnut, which is a minor. That's the minority stage. Then you've got narus, as they say in Ashkenazi terms, but Sephardic, if you look at the lettering, and I went to Menorah Primary, which was Yeshiva College, so we read it as narut. So, for example, it's so funny. You've got the word Shabbat and you've got the word Shabbos. People say good Shabbos, or they say Shabbat Shalom. It's the same word. If the funniest one is Shavuot, because somebody said to me once something Shavuot, and I just became from, and I thought, huh? He said Shavuot. I said, huh?
Yes.
A friend of mine said Shavuot. I said, I get it. You know what I'm saying? So if you've heard the word narus, it's the word narot also. It depends how you want to pronounce it. So what happens, and the last stage is bagrut, which is adulthood. Okay? So let's just discuss it. The first stage, the katnut, is when she's a minor. It lasts until she reaches 12 years of age. Okay, and sprouts 2 pubic hairs. So in other words, generally by 12 o'clock, not 12 o'clock, I'm sorry guys, it's been a long day. Usually by 12 years old, she's reached sexual maturity enough that she has more pubic hair than 2 pubic hairs, but they're saying it's got to be a minimum as far as that's concerned, unless there's severe endocrinological retardation, in which case she still stays a minor. Okay, so what happens if she has two pubic hairs before the age of 12? She's still a minor until she reaches the age of 12. What happens if she reaches the age of 12 and doesn't have 2 pubic hairs? She's still considered a minor. So both factors have to happen. Okay, and at that point she enters the stage of narut or narus. Now that state only lasts for 6 months, after which she receives the state of full adulthood. So in other words, with that development, you've got to determine the difference between full endocrinological development as well as age. So what happened is, why was it the father had certain responsibilities up until a certain age? Because people then used to have a lower life expectancy. If you remember Romeo and Juliet, they were 12 and 13. So what happened is, life was pretty simple. It wasn't the age of Tinder where you could, no, I don't like her, she's got crooked teeth, she's a bit fat, she's a bit blonde, she's a bit this, he's a bit that, he's not early 7 figures, he's not that good looking, he's not 6'8", he doesn't have so much sensitivity, but I want him to be the CEO of a big firm. You had 2 people in the village. You had one girl that was slightly overweight and one girl with crooked teeth. Those were your choices. And you'd live till maybe 35, 40, if you were lucky, and one didn't die of dysentery or a myriad of other diseases. I mean, there was no antibiotics, etc. So people got married super early, pretty much when puberty kicked in. So you've got 12 and a half was the cutoff period at which the father would no longer be responsible, and she would hit the full state of adulthood. Now, there is certain sexual maturity that even though they would marry even from probably the age of 13 or whatever the case may be, impregnation in terms of fertilization of eggs, etc., sometimes could only occur maybe at 15 and 16, but they tried as soon as possible within the constraints of endocrinology. Okay, now what I wanted to tell you is that a girl in the Naru stage is called a Nara, while a girl in the Bagru state is called a Bulgaris or Bulgarit. You've heard that term, Gavin, in Rav Simcha Steinhauer's Shir. Okay, you haven't heard the term Bagrus, you've heard the term Bulgaris. That's how he refers to it. Okay, because the one is the stage, and the other one is how do we refer to the girl woman in that particular stage. Okay. So Rav Elazar's query presumably concerns a Nara as well as a Mana. So the only two areas of a dispute are those that are still legally within the father's domain. So it's a girl up to the age of 12 that sprouts 2 pubic hairs. Then there's that intermittent period where she's got a little bit of independence, but still under her father's jurisdiction and care, at which that finishes at the age of 12 and a half, at which she fully becomes an adult. Those two stages, the father still has control over. Okay. Now, now there is a question as to whether a Nara or a lady in a young lady in the stage of Narus is under her father's dominion. The Panay Yeshua asked that in terms of Rav Elazar's query. So a Bulgaris is a full legal adult. Obviously, if she's injured, she receives full payments for her injury, according to Rashi, because since she is legally independent. The question is, according to the Panay Yeshua, is it a person in that in-between stage of 12 to 12 and a half? Is she independent at that stage? But the Gemara seems to understand generally that a girl that's a mana, as well as in that first 6 months of prepubescence towards pubescence from 12 to 12 and a half, is still under her father's care. So it also should be noted that if somebody injures this young lady, the Gemara doesn't doubt that the payments for pain, healing, and humiliation belong to the minor daughter, or the daughter in that early pre-puberty or pubescent stage, because she was the one that was injured. Okay, so pain, healing, and humiliation, medical bills, etc., go to her. And the father suffers no loss from her receiving those payments. The discussion only will center around the payments for damage, the actual nezek, and for loss of employment, because those injuries affect her father. Okay, so we're going to see why. So there's two choices. So Rav Elazar inquired of Rav, look, if somebody wounds a minor daughter of others, to whom is the injury payment made? Okay, do we say that since the merciful one conferred the gains of the girl's stage of Narus to her father, the injury payments belong to her father? In other words, the loss of employment as well as the actual nezek. As we said, pain, humiliation, and medical bills belong to the daughter because she needs to be sorted out and well. So we're saying, well, why could it perhaps belong to the father? Because the salient lessens her value. So let's just discuss these two issues. The grant. Okay, so where's this grant that it could perhaps go to the father? Okay, so if you look in Numbers, chapter 30, verse 17, it says, "These are the decrees that Hashem commanded Moshe between a man and his wife, between a father and his daughter, while in her stage of Narus in her father's house." Okay, so Narus, obviously as a minor, she's under her father care. That's not the area of dispute at all. The area of dispute is when she's considered 12, has 2 pubic hairs, and is entering the stage of adulthood. It's that 6 month It's a 6-month probationary period. Sorry, it wasn't a pun intended. She is not
Transition.
yeah. So Arthur, don't make me laugh, please. I have to edit these into YouTube. So what we're saying is she's still under her father's household, because what did it say? We're learning this in Daf Yomi. Not that I'm up to date with Daf Yomi. In Kesubot in 46b and 47a, it interprets the concluding phase to mean while in a stage in Narus. The girl is in her father's house, meaning she belongs to him. He's financially taking care of her. And that means that any gains that she realizes, that if she's earning an income, and even the money she receives for betrothal belong to the father, because he's financially supporting her. So that's fairly clear. So we're saying, again, what are we talking about? The assailant that assaulted her lessens her value. Well, the father has the right to sell his minor daughter as a Hebrew maidservant, and an injury that lessens her value adversely affects this right. Compensation paid for the injury should also be considered gains of the Narus and be given to the father. So we're saying, look, there could be a case where they're from an extremely poor family, and she's sold as a maidservant. So that doesn't preclude her getting married, because often when a Jewish woman is sold as a maidservant, I remember Rav Schottenstein said that it's almost socially pushed that the one of the sons of the slave master is encouraged actually to marry her, because this is a Jewish woman. This is a Jewish virgin. So that is encouraged. So it obviously doesn't imply that she's going to get less suitors, merely that the father can't afford to sustain her, because she might only get married at 14 or 15 and be impoverished up until that period. So if it affects her ability to earn a living, who's going to pick up the slack? It's going to be the father. And therefore, for that loss of employment, he's entitled to compensation. That's a given. But also for permanent physical damage, because this will affect two things: her ability to be employed, whether it's indentured servitude, as we said, to sustain her in terms of board and lodging and food, etc., or alternatively for employment, even if she's not a maidservant and she's a governess, for example. Guys, you know what a governess is, hey?
Wife of the governor.
No, guys, you know what I mean. You've read Jane Austen. You know what a governess is. A governess in English society was an educator that raised children. There was a lot of homeschooling, especially among the aristocracy. Certainly, you had your mass schooling, etc., that only occurred during the latter half of the Victorian era, because many poor people were illiterate and the rich wanted to keep them so. But eventually, during the Industrial Revolution, etc., people picked up skills. There was schooling. In America, funny enough, there was schooling a lot earlier than in Britain because of the class system. So what happened is a governess would raise the children in various things. In English, in French, and different languages, in the arts, the humanities, literacy, etc., as well as, so they had to basically be educated and sophisticated, but be completely subservient and dependent on their husbands for financial well-being. It was, you call, a very focused education, not to empower women. And in those days, I could understand why women wanted, obviously, a myriad of rights in order to not be married to a tyrant. But things have changed so much that the men are married to tyrants today. So go figure. Basically, you know how the compensation works. So that's the one essence. Does the father get it? There was another scenario. Perhaps it's only the gains of the stage of Narus that the merciful one conferred to the father, such as her betrothal money. Or if he wants to give her over in marriage to a man smitten with boils, he can give her over to him. So what does that phrase actually indicate? Well, firstly, that the father can pick the husband, much to the chagrin and misery of the daughter. I think it did get to a stage where the daughter had to improve in some sort of a way. but I don't know to what extent she could. I mean, we're not today's shidduchim would never tolerate that. But anyway, perhaps the Torah awarded the betrothal money to the father as a consequence of the absolute right granted to him to marry off his daughter to whomever he chose. So how do we know this? If you look at Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 16, it says, I've given my daughter to this man as a wife. And it's also in Kusubos in the 40th and 46th daf, meaning since he can choose the person his daughter marries, he can choose him even if he's ugly, as long as he's wealthy. So as a result, that money, if she's now physically marred as a result of the injury, he's going to lose out on his daughter having a shidduch that can financially support her. So the father's going to pick up the slack. And therefore, maybe since he's entitled to choose a spouse for her, he is also entitled to keep the payments as far as the loss of value. But regarding injury payments, it says, since if he wants to wound her, he may not wound her, the merciful one did not confer upon him payments for her injury. So, I mean, that's kind of obvious, because you might look at it and say, well, what sort of father would wound his daughter in return to getting the money? So we're saying, listen, that's exactly the point, is that at the end of the day, where do we get this from? In Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 25, verse 3, it talks about a court agent that administers lashes to a sinner. 40 lashes shall he strike him, he shall not add. Inasmuch as he shall not add, what does that mean, guys? It prohibits striking one who is liable to lashes excessively. So it obviously prohibits striking a person who is not liable to lashes at all. So it's saying if you can incur liability for a person that's a criminal because you over-lash them, then surely a person that's innocent, you can't even strike them at all. So therefore, that's transgressing the prohibition. That obviously you can't, you're not allowed to wound any Jewish person, let alone your own daughter. And he cannot get the injury as far as that's concerned. So it must be teaching us something more, and that is as follows. It's teaching us, since the father actually has no ownership over his daughter's injuries, we have no basis for saying that he receives the payment for an injury she sustains at the hands of others. That's the point. Since if he injured her, he wouldn't keep the money. If anybody else injures her, he doesn't keep the money either. Nor can we derive that right from the rule of the gains of Narus. In other words, we're saying, well, during that period between 12 and 12 and a half or 2 pubic hairs, she's still under her father's control in terms of now she's ready for marriage. And since he can choose a spouse, he still has a realm of control in terms of what she earns. So we say that we can't derive that right from the rule of gaining of a Narus, because even though he's got the right to the betrothal money, it's derived from a different pasuk. And because it's derived from a different pasuk, it's saying just because he gets the betrothal money doesn't mean that if she gets injured, he's entitled to that betrothal money. He might happen to get it from the suitor that proposes to his daughter, but certainly not for somebody that injures the daughter that's going to affect her right to get the money. So in other words, Rav Elazar's question really depends on the source for the girl's betrothal money being given to her father. So, guys, if the source is from the same pasuk in a Narus being in her father's house, then the same rule would apply to her injury compensation, that it belongs to the father. But, in other words, if it's derived from the father's absolute right to marry to whomever he wishes, the injury payments, if you get it from the same pasuk, would belong to him. But it's not from the same pasuk. So therefore, the father has no right to get the injury payments at all if you're interpreting it from a different pasuk. Okay, so obviously the Gemara says, well, then there's a question in that if it diminishes her value as a maidservant, it's to the father's detriment. Why shouldn't he be compensated for that real monetary loss, especially if there's permanent physical impairment and he has to take care of it? So they explain Rav Elazar's question differently, some of the commentaries. According to Rashi, the father is not inherently entitled to compensation for this loss. Why? Because he doesn't own his daughter's production in terms of her earnings, as he would a slave. She's not a slave. Okay, he's looking after her and he's granted the right to sell her as a servant if he is financially impoverished. But that's a privilege. It's not a grant of ownership. It's to basically solve her situation. So if she's damaged, that loss of value is not considered a right that he owns. It's considered almost a gain of the narus, and he's not entitled to it. Okay, so that's as far as that's concerned. So where does this leave us? So the Gemara says, Rav says to Rav Elazar, the Torah granted to the father only the gains of the girl's stage of narus. Damages are paid to the girl itself. So in other words, at the end of the day, the only thing that the father can get is if the potential suitor pays for her, her dowry, or whatever the case may be, in order to marry the daughter. He can keep that because he's looked after all those years, okay? And he has the right to nullify her vows because she's still considered not a fully fledged adult. But as far as injury payments are concerned, it can't serve as a source for this because that belongs to the daughter. She's the one that is injured. So that's what Rav says to Rav Elazar. So the damages are paid to the girl itself. The Gemara objects. It says Rav Elazar retorted to Rav from a Mishnah. And basically it says, if one who wounds a Hebrew servant is liable for all 5 categories of payment, except for the loss of employment when the servant is his. Since the master receives his servant's loss of employment payment when the injury is inflicted by a third party, a father should receive his daughter's loss of employment in such a case. What it's saying is if a master wounds his slave, in that particular case, he suffers the loss of productivity of his slave, but the slave gets all the other payments. If a third party injures the slave, he also gets the loss of employment. So just like the father could earn as a result of his daughter's ability to work or indentured servitude, that it certainly saved money. The retort that Rav Elazar says to Rav is, when you learn this, why shouldn't the father keep some of the proceeds? Okay, because Rav said to Rav Elazar, no, the only thing he can give is the dowry money, but damages are paid to the girl itself. So the Gemara answers, a buyer said, Rav does concede to Rav Elazar that regarding loss of employment, the father receives that payment because her earnings until Bachrus or until she's a Bulgaris belong to her father. Okay, so what that means is the father has the right to his daughter's earnings until she becomes a Bulgaris, which means at 12 and a half, a fully fledged adult. So a buyer says that Rav would agree that the father of a minor or Nara receives her loss of employment either stage, in either of those stages until she's a fully fledged adult. But all the other categories of payment are kept by the daughter. So it emerges that the only uncertainty is who receives the payment for permanent physical damage that lessens a daughter's value after she becomes a Bulgaris. In other words, her employment potential, as well as her potential to find a wider range of suitors. But it's definitely clear that the daughter receives the payments for pain, healing, and humiliation, and the father receives the payment for loss of employment. And as for physical damage that lessens her value during the time he could sell her or for marry her, that's obviously the point of contention, where basically Rav says to Rav Elazar that the damages belong to the daughter, and Rav Elazar says to Rav, so Rav Elazar holds that the damages go to the father. Rav holds that all payments go to the daughter. Both agree that loss of employment goes to the father. Are you with me, guys? And that the father's got no rights other than that. All right, I don't want to go into. Let me just see. Yeah, I don't want to
ask you a
I've got a
question.
question for you.
So,
Can I ask a quick question?
Of
I
course.
You
just
go
want to
first, I'll
know.
after you. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It's in connection with today, but also in connection with yesterday when we spoke, or we did it today before. In connection with slaves, I battled with the one concept. I forgot to raise it with you. I battled to understand why the slave doesn't get his lost opportunity. I understand that the master owns him, and therefore, but the slave, in essence, has become a slave because he needs not the income, but he needs the food and the drink, whatever his sustenance. So is he still given sustenance over that period while he's recuperating? Is he kicked out of servitude? I mean, when this accident happens, is he kicked out? Is he no longer a slave? Does he have to go somewhere else, or does he stay with the slave master and still receive food and those type of benefits?
Okay, so it's a very good point, Gavin. The Gemara in Gittin in the 12th daf discusses a dispute regarding whether a master has a legitimate right to impose those conditions on his slave. Go and look in Gittin in the 12th daf. Okay, as far as a Jewish slave is concerned, different story completely, is that there is certainly allowance for all of these other benefits. As far as a Canaanite slave is concerned, because they're obligated to certain mitzvahs, there are opinions that would say, no, you cannot deprive him from obviously food and drink, and that if another party injures the slave, the master gets the money, because you can think of it like an employee, that he still has to sustain the slave, but he's not making revenue off him like an employee. He can't resell his services, for example, use his services.
Yeah, that I'm fine with, because he's still sustaining him over that period while he recuperates. There I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm more talking about the time. Obviously, I mean, you understand me. The time when it's inflicted by the master, and he doesn't get to remain a slave, or he doesn't get to get sustenance.
So hang on, let's make one thing clear. It's only if you take out an eye, knock off a tooth, or have permanent damage that the slave is set free. That's number one. Number two, if that's not the case and it's time for you to heal, there's a question as to, are you allowed to do such a thing to a slave? Probably not. And as far as the rights are concerned in the slave and what sort of abuse would be allowed, at what point they would stop it or call it a day, I honestly have no idea. I do know that issue in terms of a Canaanite slave's rights with regards to a different thing. In other words, what happens is if he's kept in servitude because he's captured. Okay, he's captured. Think of it like a Taliban. And the master said, I'm not paying for your food and water at night. You can go beg for that. During the day, you're working for me as a slave. That is an issue in the 12th daf of Gittin. It can be quite hectic. So that's the source.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
All right. Kev, what's your question? I hope I answered.
Okay, so you just if the daughter gets injured, so the father's entitled to the payment to the for loss of her potential employment.
Yes.
Can you just explain that? How does it?
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
she
So
can't work. Does he get her income while she's still
yeah,
considered
so
a minor?
basically, from what I understand, if she's an absolute minor, she can't really work at certain jobs. From the age of 12 to 12 and a half, he's still got rights over her, so he can sell her at that time as a maidservant, because she is now capable of more work and provides possibly an opportunity for the master's son to marry her, or to her to provide some additional benefit to be trained in a particular job as a governess or a domestic, etc., which means that the father doesn't have to take care of her. Now, if she's injured, he has to take care of her. And it could affect not only that, but her potential to get a marriage suitor if she is disfigured or whatever the case may be. So that the loss of employment goes to the father. In terms of damages, is concerned, there's an opinion between Rav and Rav Eliezer, and that one is quite simple. Rav Eliezer says that damages, Rav says that the damages go to the girl itself. Rav Elazar says the damages go to the father, the actual nezek. But both agree that loss of employment goes to the father. And all other payments go to the daughter: medical, healing, medical pain, humiliation.